Let's talk about fishing, boating and smuggling in Eastbourne. These are the Willicks, and Willick is an old Sussex word for guillemot, and guillemots were very, very numerous around Beachy Head. So, and as we go through the talk, you'll see how nicknames are so important, and these are the Willicks, the fishermen of Eastbourne. Very, very hard life being a fishing person in Eastbourne. A real tale of courage and bravery and hardship all mixed in together. And I must say that in researching this talk, as I went through, I became more and more respectful of the hard life that the fishermen here led. This is the sort of cottages that they lived in. This would be very near the Leaf Hall in the sea houses part of town. And this is just about the only surviving piece of it. This has now been converted into holiday flats, again near to the Leaf Hall, and very, very small sort of one up and one down affairs really. Now, if you've lived in Eastbourne for any length of time, I would be amazed if you've not come across any of these names: Alcorn, Boniface, Erridge, Hyde, etc. These families are sort of like the heart and soul of Eastbourne, really. I remember going to school here. There were 5 out of those 7 names were in my school. Very, very, very common names. And going back a long time, there's a record of Erridges in Eastbourne in 1296. And there's a record of the Hydes being here by 1500. And although I've never met the gentleman, there is a member of the Hyde family, Ted Hyde, who's written some super books, and I've found them very useful. The main one of which is The Fisherman of Eastbourne, and if ever you get the chance to read it, it's a lovely book to read, full of tales of courage and all the rest of it. The Alcorns and the Bonifaces, almost certainly Huguenot names, so they would have come over in the middle of the 17th century, probably. It's a picture of a couple of the crews. You will see young lads there. They were an integral part of the crew, certainly before about 1870. If you're a lad in the East End and you're about 11 years old, you would expect to go to sea on a full-time basis. So very, very hard life. And they worked hard and they played hard. This building still here is no longer a pub, being converted into flats in Latimer Road. But the old Ocean Wave, and this was quite a lively place in its day, let's put it that way. And it's right in the middle of, shall I call it politely, the naughty part of Eastbourne. It calmed down a bit when a police station was sited there in 1905, but there are no end of jolly good fights. And of course this is now sort of buried, as it were, away from the sea in Latimer Road, but when this was fully operational, really at the height of serving the fishermen, this actually faced the sea. There was nothing built in front of it at all, as we shall see. And Christ Church was very important, quite an old church, 1859, the third church in Eastbourne, and this was known as the Fishermen's Church, and always had a long association with fishermen. In fact, every spring the priests used to bless the nets, and it was quite a long process as the nets were ceremoniously folded into the boats, and each fold apparently was blessed as it went in. This is round about 1910, 1911, I think, a visit by the Prince of Wales to Eastbourne, and the local fishermen actually constructed a welcome arch to welcome the Prince of Wales here. So very much sort of feeling part of the community, and this was, if you like, the gateway to their community at sea houses. And this is the Eastbourne Regatta, no longer taking place, but a very long-standing affair. It started in 1859, and the local fishing lads really loved this because they're really good at rowing, and they loved to take on the posh boys from other parts of town, and they called them the Jolly Dogs. They loved to take on the Jolly Dogs because they beat them hands down every time. So, earning a living, well, in inshore and deep sea fishing, a little bit of smuggling, and we'll come on to that later on, involved in salvage work. It paid fairly well. They used to get about a shilling in the pound of salvaging shipwrecks, etc. And then as time went on, 1870s, 80s, 90s, they started to diversify as the resort itself began to grow. And as we'll see, they went into pleasure boating and also involved in deck chairs and actually the management of bathing machines. So really, you know, anything to do with anything that happened on the beach. Very much a self-contained community. It was said that families were jolly good at fighting among themselves, but stayed very, very cohesive against the rest of the world. They had their own sort of welfare system. Their sort of welfare centre was a place called the Bethel, B-E-T-H-E-L, which is really where the Fishermen's Club is now. And they ran their own sort of saving schemes, their own welfare schemes, and they had what they called a compensation fund that they would pay into that would hopefully see them through hard times, because there were hard times. The fish didn't always swim in the way that they wanted them to. The number of fishermen in Eastbourne in 1851 census was 60 odd, and that almost doubled in the next 20 years up to 1870. And that was because of the coming of the railway, of course. As soon as the railway is here, 1849, it opens up far larger markets. You can get fish to London far more easily. Prior to that, it was an 8 or 9 hour ride in a cart. And you can imagine what the fish was like by the time we got to London. But even so, there were still local needs to be served. And I remember as a young lad, carts like this coming round on a Sunday, selling pints of winkles and that sort of thing. And a slice of bread and butter and your granny's hat pin, and you were away, weren't you, really? This is a map of 1875 of the Stade, S-T-A-D-E, and Stade is an old Sussex word, simply a graduated landing beach where craft can land fairly easily without a lot of rocks in the way, etc. So this was the Stade at Eastbourne. On the left-hand side of the picture, you've got the Shoreview Hotel, that area, and the big red circle on the right-hand side is the redoubt. So this is the area of the Stade in 1875, and in the middle of the Stade, I think you can see a lifeboat house situated there. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So here's just so that you know where you are. This is part of the picture of the Stade, and then going up to Fushiades off to the left. But of course, in times gone by, the front part of the development was missing totally, and so the beach, and it was a working beach, extended halfway up this picture. And this is what the working beach was like. It was grotty and dirty, and there was coal imports before the railways, of course, timber, stone, etc. Lots of heavy stuff just came in by sea into Eastbourne, and then you've got the fishing activities as well. It isn't just the boats; it's all the net drying and the net repair and the smoking and all of that goes on. Sorry, that's the smoking of the fish, not. And here's the sort of thing that happened. A lot of horses around and donkeys. Trews were the tar-covered timber that you put on the shingle so you could haul the boats up the beach. and you've got smoking sheds and the net drying sheds called Demise, which were tall buildings. They've got the similar things in Hastings still, Lucky Hastings, and they were on legs called straddles, and they had mushroom sort of caps at the top of the legs to stop the rats from getting in. So here's a nice little drawing of all the activity that's going on. I'm not sure whether it's totally to scale, but you can see the size of some of these fishing boats. These rather large luggers, they were called. There's a rather more romanticised painting. And I think this is a lovely picture. This really does show a working beach, and you can see a team of horses ready to haul that craft further up the beach. There's just a picture of the Demise, the old sheds used for net drying, etc. And here's a map of 1850. Seaside is running along the bottom. Over to the right-hand side would be the area of Fushiades. The sea is at the top. And you can see where Marine Gardens is now. That sort of area was just a wide beach with all sorts of little things going on everywhere. Drying of nets, repairing of nets, smoking of fish, etc., etc. And here's a picture. This will be the early 1870s, almost definitely taken from the new pier as it was opening. And this is sort of looking down on the seafront at Sea Houses. And a characteristic of it at that time is that that area, that part of the East End, was very poorly protected from the sea. There were sort of regular inundations into that low-lying part of the East End. And so something was done about it. 1879, they actually started on building a sea wall that went from roughly the Queen's Hotel right down to the Redoubt. And I think today, as we walk along it, we walk along the prom, we think we're just walking along a pavement. We are, in fact, walking along the top of a sea wall that's 18 feet deep. So quite a considerable thing that was built. And of course that ruined immediately the fishing activity in that area, because you can't really operate fishing boats and all the rest of it if you've got an 18-foot sea wall in front of you. And of course, when the seawall is built, it enabled all the development of Royal Parade to take place behind it, because that land was now protected from the sea. And already you can start to see the area which was a working fishing beach now being used for bathing machines and all of that sort of thing. And here's another idea. You've got little pleasure boats beginning to come in. You've got a seaside entertainer in the foreground, etc. And so all the fishermen were moved with a big fight, I have to say, down to this area. And the fishermen had really been on this original working beach for literally centuries, and thought that they owned it. And in fact, they thought they had considerable rights over it. It was interesting that when the old manor of Eastbourne was broken up and sold in 1555, you would think that this area of the Crumbles, because this is all part of the Crumbles, the massive shingle bank, would have been included in the sale. It wasn't. It was simply called the Waste and not included in any disposal. So in fact nobody owned it until 1850, and then the Duke of Devonshire and the Davis Gilbert family applied to the Enclosures Committee and actually got it drawn into their ownership. And immediately the Duke started charging a shilling a week for the rent of the cottages, whereas previously they'd always been free. So there's a massive fight that went on with the fishermen about giving up their rights and all the rest of it. And it actually went to the House of Lords, but they lost in the end. And I suppose in sort of fairness, the Duke of Devonshire gave this area, which is near to Prince's Park, I'm sure you know it, to the fishermen, for their continued use. And those square bits behind the huts at the bottom was actually called Fisherman's Green because the land was specifically conveyed for the sporting activities and leisure of the fishermen and their families. And of course, it's still called Fisherman's Green today. Interestingly, this is taken early 1920s. You can see Prince's Park has yet to be developed. It's still just wild crumbles. So here's the activity that grew up after the mid-1880s down at Fisherman's Green. Fairly standard stuff. And another area where fishermen were was at Holywell. And it isn't the Holywell that we call today Holywell, where the tea gardens were, which is right at the top of this map where it says Chalk Pit. It was further along the coast towards Beachy Head. And if you ever take a walk to Whitbread Hollow, you can walk along the high bit where there are railings, and you can look down towards the sea, and there's a couple of 100 feet below, actually. It's a long way down. You've got this area of flat land. This area called Collins Flats was originally far larger than this, has since been reduced by erosion. And there was a fishing station here really quite early on, from about 1780, 1790. And this was used by the Boniface family, almost entirely the Boniface family. And they'd been there not only fishing, but also involved in the production of lime in lime kilns. And there was also a smithy there as well. So a little sort of industrial unit almost in this part of Eastbourne. And they actually drew up their boats at the base of the cliff. And you think, well, how do they get through that circle of rocks called the Pound? And they actually carved a way through, just leaving 3 feet either side to get a boat through. You can imagine the seamanship that's wanted in rough weather under sail to get a boat through that sort of obstacle. They were there until 1896, when the Eastbourne Water Company said, oh, we need more water for Eastbourne, we're going to drill artesian wells to get the water out, and they're still doing it today in these artesian wells. There's no way we can have human habitation and lime kilns, etc., going on while all that's happening. So they were turfed off in 1896 and actually joined everybody else down at Fisherman's Green. So the boats, little punts or skiffs, the Shinermans, which were a little bit larger, and the big luggers, which were called Borners, because most of them were built in Eastbourne. So that's why they're called Borners. And here's a picture of the sort of little skiffs or punts that they used. Quite interesting, and this was just sort of used for bits of inshore fishing, etc. But it's quite interesting that in very, very rough seas, when the rollers were really coming in and it was impossible to use these for fishing, some of the fishermen went out just for fun in what they called hooker running. And what it was really was surfing the rollers in these little skiffs, which apparently was quite a spectacle, and crowds gathered on the prom to watch. And the fishermen on the shore went round with a hat collecting money for the local Leaf Hospital, which I thought was really good. There's another picture of just a skiff under sail. These are the slightly larger Shinermen. Most of the boats, as I say, were built in Eastbourne. There was a large boat yard in Beach Road run by a chap called Gorsden, who employed over 100 men building boats. And then later there was another one opened by a John Gowland in Winchelsea Road. But that was after 1900. And here's one of the larger luggers, the large Borner. And they used to say that they were far faster and more manoeuvrable than the Hastings boat. The number 3NN, you know, the system for registration. you have to register a fishing boat at the nearest port with a customs house. In our case, New Haven, and they take the registration, the first and last letter of the word, NN for New Haven, so hence New Haven. It comes a bit more complicated when you think of a Hastings boat, which is registered in Rye, its nearest port. And you think, well, they've got RX on the side. Why hasn't it got RE, first and last of Rye? And that's because Ramsgate has taken RE, so Rye and Hastings are RX. So types of fishing. Interestingly, the Crumble stock pond has been used since the 13th century. And you think, well, where's the Crumble stock pond? It's a Prince's Park boating lake. It is not an artificial feature. It's a natural feature in the Crumbles. Rod and line fishing, a kettle net, which we'll talk about, that's quite interesting. Drift nets, which were typically about 120 feet long, pegged together, normally by a young lad of 11 going out in a rowing boat from the main boat and linking all the drift nets together, sometimes being 1 or 1.5 miles long. You've got the pots for the lobsters, of course. And here's a kettle net. This is quite interesting. This is put out on the shore at low tide. The tide comes in, it's all covered with water. Fish comes running along and comes up against the net. And any fish apparently coming up against the net like this will turn towards deeper water. So they turn and run into the kettle net and can't get out again. Tide goes out and you've got a whole load of stuff of all shapes, sizes and colours. I don't know if the phrase "a pretty kettle of fish" comes from that, but it's interesting, isn't it? And I think it's just an iconic photo, this one, of a chap mending his lobster pots. And prawning at Holywell, nice little picture. And the catch, herring in winter. The herring in the 19th century, from all accounts, the size of the shoals were beyond our belief. Literally millions and millions of fish in the shoal. And the boats from Eastbourne and other fishing areas would follow the herring down the North Sea, through the Channel, and sometimes as far as the Irish Sea, putting into a different port each day. And if things were really good, one of those large luggers, those borners, could catch 50,000 herring in one day, in one landing. It's quite amazing. The mackerel in summer, typically they were corralled towards the shore with a net between a couple of rowing boats. And people used to say that the sea just turned silver as thousands of mackerel came to the surface. Plaice, sole, skates, etc. Lobster, crabs, scallops. This was really on the Holywell ledge and the Burning Gap ledge, and also around the rocks, the Royal Sovereign rocks, 7 miles out to sea. Dogging at Holywell. This isn't meant in the modern sense of the word. This is looking for huss and rock salmon, dogfish. Very, very, very numerous in the Holywell area. And oysters at Beachy Head. Prior to the 1870s, apparently the oyster beds off Beachy Head extended for many, many square miles. Absolutely massive. And they were radically overfished by the Brighton fleet for 10 years, and all the beds just disappeared. This is a picture in the early 1900s at Fisherman's Green. The building in the background is what we know as the Beach Hotel. And interestingly, the Beach Hotel had a special drinks licence. I think the only pub in Eastbourne to have one at that time. The fishermen used to fish at night at this time, early 1900s. They would come in at about 4:30 in the morning, and in just 2 hours they would unload, sell their catch, pack, and it was on the 6:30 train to London that morning. It's an incredibly efficient operation, and exhausted as they were, they needed a pint. And of course the licence, special licence for the Beach Hotel, actually started at 6 a.m. in the morning to have a pint. So the demise after World War I, well, first of all for the First World War, because of their expertise and their fantastic knowledge of local waters, the fishermen were all called up for motorboat patrol duties, inshore duties, and they were away, of course, for 4 years, and you know all the kit deteriorated, and it was never the same after the war. Motorised boats started to be introduced in 1912. They are more difficult to beat because you've got the propeller to worry about, low fish prices generally, competition from the East Coast ports, and there were easier ways to make a living in pleasure boats and deck chairs and all of that. So we saw a substantial decline of the industry. It ticked along. This is a picture from about 1930, catching sprats. So it's, you know, the stuff is still happening, and in modern times, round about 1990, what was left of the fishing fleet left Fisherman's Green, and of course went down to the marina, the harbour. Now here's a nice little. This isn't an actual photo. This is an artist impression of what the new Fisherman's Wharf could look like at the harbour, and the building on the extreme right of the picture is the Harvester pub, so you know sort of roughly where you are. The value of fishing to Eastbourne at the moment, well, it's sort of doubled in over a 9-year period. Now about £3 million, not a massive amount, but you know, £8,000 a day, enough to give some people a living. And particularly if this Fisherman's Wharf proposal comes about, I think that's going to be a real feather in the cap in terms of attractions for Eastbourne. There's nothing like, you know, going to a Fisherman's Wharf and buying, you know, fish just off the boat, etc. So, one thing I better talk about very quickly is saving lives. Apart from fishing, they saved a lot of lives because the lifeboats, until recent decades, were manned almost entirely by fishermen, all on a voluntary basis. The first lifeboat in Eastbourne was in 1822, and that was 2 years before the RNLI itself actually came into being. And it was sponsored by a local MP, the MP for Battle. There were only 2 MPs for Sussex at that time, called Mad Jack Fuller. Oh, you might have heard of Mad Jack. Well, he sponsored the first lifeboat, which again was built in Eastbourne, about 25 feet long with 10 oars, and as I say, manned entirely by local fishermen. And throughout time, the fishermen sort of maintained that tradition. This is a photo taken round about 1900, and certainly at that time, half of the entire crew, it was about a crew of 17 normally, half the entire crew were from the Erridge family. And apparently there's always been an Alcorn in the lifeboat crew. And just a lovely, iconic picture again of the lifeboat coming back. Incredibly courageous things some of these guys did, absolutely amazing. Sometimes horses were needed. There was one famous time when there was a shipwreck off Burling Gap in incredibly high seas, and the lifeboat couldn't leave Eastbourne, so they actually took it by horse, taking 3 hours across the Downs to Burling Gap, and actually launched it from Burling Gap. Quite amazing feats. And the lifeboat, of course, used to service the Royal Sovereign. This was the original lightship on the Royal Sovereign rocks. Royal Sovereign so called, apparently, because the Royal Sovereign led the English line at the Battle of Beachy Head in 1690. We were on the side of the Dutch fighting the French, and we lost, but never mind. But apparently that's why it's named Royal Sovereign. And this lightship was there in 1875, and apparently was the first one in the world to have a revolving light on the top. So there we are. Where was the lifeboat kept? Well, this says Eastbourne Corporation Electricity Department. This was just after 1900, but prior to that, this building certainly from 1850, had housed the lifeboat. And this is located just behind the Leaf Hall in Marine Road. And in 1898, they moved into this fine place, which I'm sure you'll recognise, by the Wish Tower. And it wasn't an enormous success because there were problems apparently with the gradient of the beach at this point, and there were rocks in the way. It wasn't the perfect place to actually have a lifeboat. So really quite quickly a substitute or number 2 station was erected at Fisherman's Green. This continued until 1926, and then 11 years later became the museum that we see today. And this is the corrugated shed lifeboat house at Fisherman's Green, and that was in service right up until 1993. It's a nice picture of it being launched. I remember as a little lad when I was in this area and heard the maroon go off. Do any of you remember the maroon that went off? Absolutely enormous bang. And you know, you had about 3 or 4 minutes to get down there and to actually see the lifeboat being launched. A tremendous thrill to see. And then in 1993, if you can see in the great big square of the outer harbour, there's a little dot there. If you've been to Specsavers recently, a little dot, and that's where the lifeboat is moored now. So, boating. This is one of the things that the fishermen diversified into. This is taken, I can be fairly accurate about this. This is about 1888. It's just before the first bandstand was built. And it was after, I think, a massive storm in 1887 that scoured away most of the beach. And you can see, you know, we're talking about the sea wall 18 feet deep. You can see some of it there. And very, very difficult, of course, in those circumstances to accommodate boats. And you can see some of them are actually parked up on the parade. And if you walk along the parade, even today, and look down at the low brick wall, you can still see the iron rings that are in there where they used to tether up the rowing boats. And these are the more graceful sailing ships that would you know, take at least a couple of dozen people and even more. Some folk think that well, all the fishermen did was just sort of take their fishing boats and sort of give them a bit of a scrub, and they sort of use them in the summer to take trippers out and about. Well, totally untrue. The fishing craft would have been totally useless in this sort of circumstance, with one exception that I'll talk about in a moment. That's a nice picture, a really sort of graceful craft. You can imagine in Victorian times how nice this would have been to go for a cruise. This picture was taken at the bottom of Victoria Steps. Victoria Steps comes down from what we now call the top of Terminus Road. Used to be called Victoria Place. That's why it's called Victoria Steps. And from here down to the pier, no bathing machines allowed or anything like that. It was boats only. And in fact, the Alcorn family were given the prime pitch in 1902 at the bottom of Victoria Steps. The prime pitch because everybody coming from the station or the tourists come straight up Terminus Road and they hit this bit of the beach first. On the other side, this is by the Queen's Hotel, there are also some larger sailing craft. And then as you go further down on the east side towards Fushiades, again you can see parked up the seawall little boats that would say take half a dozen people at the time. And you could also hire rowing boats. And I can remember right up to the 1950s, you could still hire rowing boats and without any practice or anything else, you just sort of go off to sea. Lovely health and safety thing. So regulation and control. 1875, not only the sailing boats and the rowing boats had to be licensed, they had to pass, you know, a condition of serviceability, but the boatmen themselves were licensed into first and second class. If you were first class, you could take people out under sail. Second class, no sail, but rowing only. And they had a parade inspector who would make sure that everybody had their license, etc. There was a disaster in '76 when somebody actually took out an old mackerel boat, not really suitable at all for taking visitors out. It was under full sail, and the chap looking after it, I don't think was particularly experienced, and the whole thing capsized, and 12 people were drowned. Entirety of the boat drowned. 1890, the first steam-driven boat, quite interesting. You're under steam. It's more flexible because you're not reliant on the wind under sail. 1891, all boats now had to have a Board of Trade certificate. A local certificate wasn't enough. And you see there, touting confined to beach and sands only in '94, really to stop the nuisance of people being obstructed on the parade. Now here's I know this chap is an Alcorn because he's got Golden City, and Golden City was one of the early Alcorn boats. On his cap, he's got first class, which is his sort of license, and the license has to be worn on the cap. If he doesn't wear the cap, he doesn't work. It's as simple as that. So from 1900, as I say, you've got the Alcorns there at the bottom of Victoria Steps. They were there over 100 years later. Must have been a good pitch. The ticket hut and winches were installed early 1930s. 1933, bad day for the rowing boats. The council introduced what they call float boats. We probably know them better as pedalos. Do you remember those things they used to have? And they were run by the council. The William Alcorn, which I think most of us will remember, was built at New Haven, followed by 2 boats from Sayers, and then Alcorns bought out Sayers, but kept their Southern Queen in 1964. So Alcorns were the sole operators from 64. Some competition, of course, from the paddle steamers that started to operate in Eastbourne from 1890, but this was, of course, more expensive to use. Even in 1920, you could go to Boulogne and back for half a guinea. Isn't it incredible? And in the, I can remember this, in the 1950s, for some reason, Eastbourne did a special deal with the Home Office, and you could actually go to France on a day trip without a passport. Can you imagine that now? Getting ashore, I've often wondered in these sailing boats how people sort of actually got ashore at the end of the trip. That's one way. You can see a chap being carried. And latterly, some of you may remember these, the landing stage and all the rest of it. And you might also remember this. You remember the greasy old winches that were used to take everything in and out. And here's a lovely William Alcorn, not appeared now for what, 5 or 6 years. I know there's a trust trying to renovate it, and I do wish them every success, because it'd be lovely to see that plying its trade up and down again. Right, that's the end of that bit. We've got 20 minutes left, and we're going to talk about smuggling. All right? This is quite interesting, this bit. Picture from Turner, round about 1820, smugglers off Folkestone. Now, do you remember this from school days? 5 and 20 ponies trotting through the dark, brandy for the parson, baccy for the clerk, laces for a lady, letters for a spy, watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by. Kipling, Smuggler's Song. Quite a few clues in here. 5 and 20 ponies, not just a couple of lads, gangs. Brandy for the parson, baccy for the clerk, everybody's involved in this. Laces for a lady, letters for a spy. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by. Don't get mixed up with this lot, you'll regret it. This is the sort of, I suppose, the conventional idea of smuggling. Somebody with a couple of barrels, a little bit of cottage industry on the side, somewhere in Cornwall or whatever. And for a lot of the country in the 18th and going into the 19th century, this is what it was. It was sort of small scale sort of stuff. Not so round here. Smuggling isn't a new thing. Import duties were applied to fund the Crusades and every single war since, of course. English wool envied throughout Europe, massively high tax to stop it being exported. Clearly an arms embargo because we're always fighting the French or the Dutch or whatever. And then, of course, in the 18th century, even more wars to fund, and massive tax on tea, 127% tax on tea, and also on gin, brandy, etc. And the higher you put the tax on, the more profitable it is to smuggle stuff in. And it wasn't just one way. Because it was so prized, wool and the sheep with the wool on them was actually smuggled out. Iron cannon from the High Weald was smuggled out. Difficult to put up your jacket, that one. And then golden guineas, and particularly after the French Revolution. If we talk about the 1790s, they reckoned that across the Sussex and Kent coast, 10,000 guineas went across the coast each day. Because as soon as it got to France, there was a 50% markup. Worth doing. The activity peaked from really that century, from 1720 to 1820. Dedicated distilleries were set up in what's now Belgium, Ostend, places like that, purely to service the English smuggling market. Quite amazing. Foreign ships, if you like, floating supermarkets of contraband would anchor 3 miles off the shore, and tenders would go out, and you could go out and sort of say, oh, what would I like today? And buy your contraband and bring it back in. And as it says there, it actually was an industrial scale. And if you can think of the quantities here, you're talking about something like 9,000 bottles of gin, 9,000 bottles of gin, whatever that is, 2,700 bottles of brandy. And do you remember those £1/4 packs of tea? 10,000 of those. Can you imagine all of that as a quantity? This was what was smuggled across the local coast here per day. Absolutely amazing. Just think of the organisation that's needed for that sort of activity. Quite incredible. And I don't know if this is the Underground Theatre's Christmas party, but gin, of course, was a great ruin. 1736. The tax on gin went up from 2 shillings a gallon to 20 shillings a gallon, a 10-fold increase. So gin or Geneva, incredibly popular to smuggle in. Is the coast clear? Smugglers always made sure they had a choice of landing sites available to them in case the revenue men were around, and they were often not around because there weren't very many of them. The boats typically had black sails and hulls so that they wouldn't show up. They were really fast ships who could really outrun the so-called water guard. Top-notch crews because they were paid a fortune. Fast unloading by batmen. There's 2 columns of batmen would surround the beaching site, armed with really baseball bats, and there would be dozens of them. And that was like a cordon sanitaire, and lo and behold, anybody who tried to go through that. They had tubmen, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the logistics of getting this quantity of material in secret from the coast to the London market on a daily basis was just quite amazing. All credit to them in a way. This is a tubman, and he's got what's called a half anchor of spirits on his front and the same on the back. Each weighs about 50 pounds. So he's carrying 100 pounds, and he's expected to walk up to 10 miles per night carrying that. But well rewarded. Some tricks of the trade. Sink now and collect later. If you think the revenue men are around, you sink the barrels of brandy or whatever in the sea, put a little float on and collect them later. Some barrels, of course, with false compartments. The specialist distilleries on the Belgian coast would make these spirits deliberately over strength so that they could be watered down later, just reduces the weight. In a nutshell, this is interesting, they used to take walnuts, carefully open them, take out the inside, press in a lady's silk glove and then glue it up again. In a nutshell. The gangs. The gangs were just awful. I mean, like, you know, I suppose you would say the most gruesome of drug gangs as we have currently. Based in the High Weald, conveniently halfway between here and the London market. The High Weald at this time, we talk about 18th, 19th century, very, very difficult to penetrate, very easy to get lost in. Most notorious gangs from Hawkhurst, Mayfield and Groombridge, they could muster up to 500 men in an hour. And there's a parliamentary committee that reported in 1745, and they reckoned that 20,000 men in Kent and Sussex were involved in the smuggling industry. Quite incredible. You can see the financing there. The marketing and distribution was quite amazing when you think they've not only got to reach the London market, but for areas north as well. And in terms of being untouchable, these gangs were just so belligerent and so threatening that a lot of magistrates were very, very reluctant to take any action against them whatsoever. In a sense, it was like the mafia operating. But for all that, locals loved them. First of all, it's a poke in the eye for the revenue. If they're charging you a tenfold increase in your gin tax, you want to try and get your own back. A nice little earner for some. That tub man, who would have been an agricultural worker, would earn a shilling a day when he could get work as an agricultural worker. He would get half a guinea, 10 shillings a night, just for that night's work. Little bit of bunts if you're a local farmer and you happen to leave your stable door unbolted and 20 horses are borrowed for the night, and you get a nice little barrel of brandy for your trouble in the morning. It's worth getting involved in. People provided local hiding places. Sometimes if the revenue men were sniffing around, they liked to leave it locally and then take away later. Aiding and abetting, fake news. 1815, locals told the revenue men there's going to be a big operation going on at Birling Gap tonight. Right, so the revenue men trot off to Birling Gap and do in fact find some men with barrels. It's just that the barrels are full of salt water, and it really was a red herring. Meanwhile, 200 men were on Langley crumbles doing the real job. Quite amazing. Secret signals. This is sort of the residents, local residents, telling the gangs that the coast is clear. Windmills would be set at a certain angle, upright instead of diagonal. Shutters would be half closed on windows. Certain numbers of knickers would be placed on a washing line or whatever. There are all sorts of ways of telling people. So what was the involvement of our local fishermen? They operated their own cross-channel trips from time to time. They acted as tenders for the Coopers, these floating supermarkets 3 miles out. They would take people out and back again. Because of their knowledge of local waters, clearly a lovely role as pilots and lookouts. And of course, they never used their real names. All local fishermen, I think even to this day, have nicknames, because the last thing you do when the revenue men are about is call somebody by their real name. Local smuggling hotspots. Well, first of all, you've got the Stades, the level landing beaches at Norman's Bay, Pemsley Bay and the Crumbles. you've got the more difficult but manageable sites like Burling Gap, Crowlink and Cuckmere Haven, we'll talk about in just a moment. And you've got those Collins Flats near to Holywell that we talked about, and even the area around the Wish Tower. Because when you go back to about 1800, there's hardly anybody there anyway. Really quite remote areas at that time. And this is Collins Flats again, where stuff came in and could fairly easily be taken out under cover of darkness. This is a picture of Cow Gap. And this, you can actually see here, this is interesting. You can't do it now because of all the erosion of the cliffs, but you could actually get carts down onto the beach at Cow Gap. Crowlink. Crowlink was just well known throughout the south coast as being a very good cart gap. And the cart gap is where you could actually get horse and carts down onto the beach to unload. And Jevington was, if you like, the forward operation post for that. Interestingly, in the London market, they actually put the labels on the gin bottle, genuine Crowlink Geneva, as if it was a guarantee of quality. It's that good, it's come in through Crowlink. I think it's quite amazing. And then, of course, you've got Cuckmere Haven. On Tuesday evening, between 200 and 300 smugglers on horseback, so that's at least 200 and 300 horses, came to Cuckmere to receive various goods from the boats. Though the seas ran mountain high, the daring men in the cutters made good their landing. That just shows the scale of everything that went on. Dire punishment, executions did take place. Transportation, which is even worse than execution, going to Australia. Pressed into Navy service, fines and imprisonment, premises destroyed. In Eastbourne Road here by the traffic lights with summer down, there's burnt cottage. Burnt cottage, not sure it was called that at that time, 1830, discovered a lot of contraband in the cellars. The local magistrates said this place is to be razed to the ground, and it was, hence burnt cottage. But such was the support of local people for these smuggling activities that the cottage was rebuilt by public subscription. It's still there today, burnt cottage. And of course boats were sawn in half. So for a fisherman that's the end of your living and you're off to the workhouse. So the end of an era. Levels of duty reduced, particularly the tea tax came down in 1784, and we had, wait for it, free trade agreements by 1840. And the Martello Towers, of course, came into existence in the very early 1800s, and they were all garrisoned by soldiers. The new Coast Guard service starts off in 1830, and generally coastal areas became less remote as the resorts began to develop and more people lived by the sea. So a very, very interesting 100 years, and this area was right in the thick of it. So time to drop anchor, that's it.